Hey WatchTouch, welcome to our new platform to discuss the many fascinating aspects of the digital age. I'm your host Drew Daring and let's get into it. Today we will talk about the process in which people review the games they play. Specifically, we want to find an answer to how long a game should be played before deciding whether that game was worth the money you spent on it. Ideally, a person would finish their game before determining this answer, but is it possible to arrive at the same conclusion at a much earlier point in the game? If we want to test this other extreme of time spent with a game, we will need a new way to evaluate our gaming experience, and that is where the 12 labors come into play. The 12 labors of gaming are a set of ideals, such as intuitiveness, personal enjoyment, and immersion, to measure when determining the value of a game. This started as a joke between me and my number one best friend and local car detailer, Connor Kilburn. Every time I would say anything negative about a game I just picked up, Connor would be sure to bring up the time that I decisively labeled Injustice Gods Among Us as trash within the first 12 minutes of playing it, and he made it clear that it was unfair to decide the overall value of the game so quickly without being able to give it a chance to express itself. I agree that it doesn't sound very logical to be able to completely analyze every core aspect of the game and calculate its value in a measly 12 minutes, but that is exactly what the 12 labors of gaming tries to accomplish, and ambitiously, it tries to accomplish all of it within a 12-minute time limit. So, the 12 labors of gaming consist of 12 vectors that help a player determine a rough estimate of whether that game is right for them. These vectors should be aspects that are easily recognizable within the first 12 minutes of playing the game, but as we'll discuss later, these principles are not always perfect, and can lead to false readings depending on how the opening sections of the game play compared to the later sections. While this tool should work well for games with consistent pacing throughout, it may not work well for games with more dynamic pacing. Therefore, the effectiveness of our chosen method will highly depend on the game and its players' preferences. Now that we know that our 12 labors are not perfect, let's start describing our chosen vectors. The first vector is intuitiveness. Basically, intuitiveness describes whether a game is easy to pick up or not. Do the controls feel natural, or are you struggling to remember which buttons do certain things? The controller is how the player interacts with the game. If they aren't confident controlling the game, then the value of the game can drop significantly for the gamer. Giving players options to change the control scheme can greatly increase adaptability for a game, but sometimes games have very limited options or no options at all. Intuitiveness can also describe how quickly a player can understand what their goal is, and devise some sort of plan to achieve it. A player should never be stuck not knowing how to advance in the beginning of a game, having to rely on exposition or lengthy instructional dialogue. A game should always be easy to pick up, but hard to master. Intrigue. How much effort must a game put in to keep its players interested in what they're doing? Is their objective meaningful to them? Do they connect with the characters? Do they feel any level of attachment at all to the world that the game has provided? This is intrigue. Can the game keep players playing out of pure curiosity of what's to come, or does the idea of progression feel too distant? Being able to establish an emotional tie with a player is what will separate it from the rest. Next on our list is progression. We decided to separate progression into two separate vectors, game progression and player progression. Game progression basically describes whether the player is satisfied with the pace of their progression through the game. Is the game too hard and halting progress and upsetting the player as a result? Or is the game too mind-numbingly easy, not allowing the player to feel like they're being challenged? Ideally, there should be a balance, but having a set difficulty can result in varying results for players with different skill levels. On the other hand, player progression describes the rate at which the player feels like they are progressing in knowledge and skill for the game. A game should be able to teach its player new concepts by means of exploration without being overwhelmed by choices and without holding their hand the entire game. Having an NPC constantly halting the experience by simply giving the player a long explanation of what to do next can be quite infuriating, especially when the player could have already discovered this information before being forced in a dialogue box and robbed of the satisfaction. On the other hand, a game shouldn't feel too open, making the player feel overwhelmed by every possible direction they can take. The game needs a sense of direction without the player feeling like they're following a predetermined line. The audio-video vector is an overall look at how the graphics and audio of a game work together to create an atmosphere for the player. While this is probably the most objective of all the vectors, it is worth noting that a game's style might feel rushed, lazy, or too over the top for some players to handle, limiting their level of immersion. Exposition. Yeah, I've talked for too long to be complaining about the exposition in games, so you get the point. If the story is interesting, meaningful, and it takes a backseat to gameplay, then that's great. Okay, gameplay optimization. A game should feel like you're experiencing the best parts of the game the most often. If the gameplay is being bogged down by elements that seem unnecessary, out of place, or just could have been improved for intuitive control or better fluidity in the game progression, then the game should be marked down in value, honestly. For example, a game should not make a player navigate long menu screens to find out stats or to equip new items in the middle of an important battle. Keyboard shortcuts, HUD elements, and the avoidance of necessary side quests are a great way to optimize the game and keep the player focused on what's most exciting. Multiplayer and community support. Okay, sometimes a game should rely on more than just itself to push a player to want to be better. Adding multiplayer to a game can add a whole new dimension of fun for a player, as the game is now allowing the player to compare their skills to their peers. Even without multiplayer, a community that backs a game can be quite empowering for the rate of adoption for a game. Speedrunning, for example, doesn't require a multiplayer game, but people from across the world are still competing for the fastest time. Esports is also a way to perpetuate the fun for decades after a game's release. Take Super Smash Bros. For example. Melee Smash's second iteration came out in 2001, but it is still going strong today thanks to its esports scene and growing spectator audience. Smaller local tournaments allow new players to pick up the game and still experience the community benefits without having to be a top player, which is partly why the community is growing even today. Freedom and customization. A game should not feel like a movie, but instead should feel like it is giving a player a unique experience based on their choices and preferences. Giving freedom to a player can give them the opportunity to connect with the environment and put their own spin on it. Another great way to accomplish this is to allow the player to express their personality through customizable traits for their character or avatar. Personality, while being one of many games in a genre doesn't inherently make it a bad game, giving a game something to set it apart from every other game in that category is greatly appreciated by the player, who probably doesn't want to feel like they're sitting through the exact same experience twice, giving money to two different developers for the exact same experience. Personality in a game is what a player can look back to years after finishing a game. Immersion. This vector is tested by how well a game has taken a player out of their world and into the game's. Sometimes you encounter a game that you don't want to stop playing, not even realizing that you've been playing for far beyond 12 minutes, without feeling that your time has been wasted. This is immersion at its best. The 12th and final vector is personal enjoyment. This vector basically describes whether the player is enjoying their time with the game. Are they having fun, or does the game feel like a burden or chore list? This is a very important aspect of the game that should be apparent within the first 12 minutes of playing. If a player isn't having fun within the beginning stages of the game, then what are their chances of having fun 10 hours into the game? A game shouldn't rely on player progression to become fun. A game should ideally be fun from the beginning and increase their level of enjoyment as the player progresses. So here are the 12 aspects of the game that we'll be looking at when we conduct our 12-minute review of a game. Now that we've finished describing our process, we can finally get into the game. Today I've chosen Charlie and the Chocolate Factory for the Nintendo GameCube as the perfect specimen for my test. As a child, I rented this game and determined that it was the worst game I had ever played and stopped playing very early on into the game. Let's see if I was right. The game sucks.